Yes.
Okay.
So here we go. Okay. So hello there. I'm Lesley, and I offer research support on the Woodlanders project. And at the moment, I'm thinking about the census. I just filled in my own census this weekend. It took me about 20 minutes. It's a fantastic, a huge project that goes right back to the early 19th century. And every 10 years, the government gathers loads and loads of information about households and about people throughout the land. Obviously, this can be quite personal information and sometimes even quite sensitive. So it's not made public, that individual information isn't made public for 100 years after each census is taken. And the most recent one that we've got is for 1911. And the 1921 one is going to come out next year. But when it does become public, it offers a huge amount of information and a wonderful, wonderful resource for the Woodlanders project, because the Woodlanders project is looking at the villages and the lives of the people in those villages, the people who were working in the rural industries, things like domestic industries, where they're working at home on things like lace making, straw plaiting, chair making, and beading. And the census has got a huge amount of information that's relevant to that. And we, in the Woodlanders project, we're using the census in various ways. But one particular way, Keith Spencer, has been particularly involved in, and he's going to tell us about that now. And perhaps you'd also tell us, Keith, about, you know, how you got involved in the Woodlanders project and, you know, what you've been getting out of it. Okay, over to you.
Hi, yes, as Lesley says, I'm Keith. I'm basically a volunteer. I have no local connection with this area at all. I just have an interest in local history. I think it's fascinating to look at the lives of people who were here before us and who shaped the landscape that we live in. So when I, courtesy of the Royal Air Force, ended up in this part of the world and eventually retired, one of the things I did was to volunteer at the museum in Wickham. And it was through the contact that the Woodlanders project made with the museum that was then passed on to me to see whether I'd be interested, and that's how I got involved. I also, as it happens, have done quite a lot of work with spreadsheets. I mean, I guess a lot of people watching this will have researched their own family history, as I did, and you'll know what Lesley was saying about how useful it is. And one of the things that I had done in my own family history was to take the census return, put the data into spreadsheets, and then create some very simple, fairly crude graphs and charts that showed how the average age grew over time and how the jobs my ancestors did changed over time. And so when we started doing this project, and Lesley and Helena started saying, well, okay, this is what we're thinking of doing. We want to collect it, put it in a spreadsheet. I did my local village, Knapp Hill and Walters Ash, its twin, and then submitted it with this fairly simple, fairly crude way that I had of analysing the data by things like age grouping or obviously occupation, and then using that data to produce charts and graphs, which seemed to go down quite well. And I don't think I've stopped developing it ever since, because once you start on this sort of thing, the classic, when I worked in computing, we used to call it scope creep. In other words, the idea that, oh, well, if you could do that, wouldn't it be really nice if you could do this little bit as well, please? And that's true. One of the problems you have, though, when you have a project like this, and I use the word problems advisedly, it's not really a problem, but it's one of the things you have to remember, is that if you're dealing with volunteers, it's not the same as dealing with employees. You can't say to them, right, this is the computer system you are going to use, and this is what you are going to do with it. You want a system that they feel comfortable with, they feel relaxed with, that they feel quite happily using. So we tried to put together a system. We decided to use spreadsheets, mainly Excel, although not others use different ones, where we said, okay, fine, these are the columns we want you to use, and this is the order we want you to use them in, and that will then be standard across the whole project. But when it comes to doing the analysis, okay, here are some ideas, and so we have created some charts, but we've also said, well, okay, off to the sort of side, volunteer, if you have something that is of particular interest to you, then fine, feel free to do that, because we're not going to slap you on the wrist and say, oh, that's out of scope, because we want this to be, you know, it's something that people enjoy doing. So we cribbed basically what I had done in my family history to start off with. And so what I'll do is I'll just flip over to give you a quick view of what we did. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. This is Bradnam. This is where we start off. Once you've extracted the data, this is the standard sort of data you get from pretty well every census: who people are, where they lived, how old they were, whether they were married, where they were born, and crucially for us, of course, what occupation they have, this column here. And so we've done some analysis, fairly simple, crude way of analysing. We spent a lot of time, Lesley did an awful lot of work, trying to sort of group the occupations by headings. We then added those up, and we've then taken the data and produced charts. And you can see here, this chart over here just literally says this is how many people in Bradnam in the year 1871 were doing each of these occupations. And on the left-hand side, there are some pie charts that show you some other occupations. That's what we call the in-year spreadsheet. The question then is, well, okay, this is 1871. How does it change over time? Okay, fine. So, as I said, we were seeing just now 1871, which is this area here in the middle, but how does it compare with other years? So we have this, what we call this year-on-year spreadsheet, which basically takes the summarized data. And as you can see here, we have all the occupations across all of the years. I happen to have done 1841 because Bradnam's a small parish. It's not a major issue. So it has some data that's useful. It's not as useful as later ones, but I've done it anyway. This is a fairly busy chart, as you can see, because we've got a lot of occupation groups spread over, in my case, all 8 years. So we've done a fairly simple feature that Excel have that enables you to pick and choose. For example, if we look here, I'm going to just choose agricultural workers, because this is an interesting one where you can clearly see that there was a peak of agricultural workers in the middle of the 19th century and it tailed off. So where did these people go? What did they do? Did they leave the area? Did they disappear? Or did they do something else? Well, if we show that alongside the domestic support, domestic labourers, you can see that what appears to have happened is that as there was a less demand for agricultural workers, they moved more indoors to be domestic servants, things like that. This is the sort of story that you can tell. And obviously there's a lot more we're looking at. We're focusing on 4 particular occupations. And again, we have a similar story for lace making, where people seem to have switched into beading, and this sort of chart shows you that. So this is what we're looking at, this is what we're trying to do, and this is the story we're getting out. We're trying to cover as many parishes in the area as we can. Obviously, we're not going to do all of them. Lesley, I know, is keeping an eye on which parishes, and I know there are certain sort of areas within the South Chilterns that we haven't yet covered, so we're always looking for volunteers, and anybody who was interested in one of the parishes we haven't covered, Lesley, I'm sure, would be delighted to hear from you. But is it fun? Is it enjoyable? Yes, it is. Yes, it's great fun. It certainly shows up things that you maybe didn't know about your area. So certainly I would recommend anyone to do it. I suppose the final question is, okay, this is all very fascinating stuff. What's going to happen to all this data when the project finishes? And at that point, I'll hand back to Lesley, who will explain where it's all going to go.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Thanks. Yes, I think it's going to go into 2 places. So that on the one hand, we've got the basic, as it were, like the transcription of the census, which is the basic data which we've copied out in a different format. And that we very much hope that that's going to go to the Buckinghamshire Family History Society, and that it'll be available for anybody to use through the Family History Society. And then the other bit, the stories, really, that Keith was just talking about towards the end on the graphs and the charts and things that come out of those, then, you know, that story about the agricultural workers and the servants, well, that's really, really interesting. So somebody's probably going to be investigating that further to make, you know, to see exactly how that worked. You know, did somebody who was an agricultural labourer then become a servant, or, you know, how did it work? And those, the things that we're going to find out from that, those kind of parts of the project, we're going to go at the end of the Woodlanders project into the Buckinghamshire archives, where it'll all be there again, available for other people to use in the future. So it's got a long legacy, a long and lasting legacy, we hope. So anyway, thank you very much, Keith, for explaining all about that.
My pleasure. Thank you.